Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. Well, we're moving away, since we've done a lot of 20th century recently, we're moving away from that into Alina's golden spot. She's dragging me down an ancient history rabbit hole, which is going to go on for a while. And we have a wonderful speaker lined up for you today. But before I get to that, I just have to do the usuals. Otherwise, Alina shoots me and takes away my book privileges. So, as you know, History Hack has its new website at historyhack.co.uk, where you can meet the team, sign up for different things, and also buy merchandise from our favourite beardy weirdy cartoonist, when you can have your favourite stuff put on t-shirts, etc. If you'd like to support the podcast in a more meaningful way to help me buy books when Alina takes away my book privileges, you can sign up to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/historyhack, where there are obviously various different tiers, and the more that you support, the more perks you get, including apparently Chris perks, which my lawyers are still going over. I'm not entirely certain I want to sign off to some of those, but at the moment I'm kind of tied in. And if not, and you just want to support us on a one-off, if you've really enjoyed an episode, then you can support us on Ko-fi, which is ko-fi.com/historyhack, and buy us a drink. Mine is a rum and coke, because my throat's going and I need it. But more importantly, we have an excellent ancient historian here today to talk to us. We have Daisy Dunn, who is an award-winning author and classicist, whose previous books include Not Far from Brideshead, Oxford Between the Wars, In the Shadow of Vesuvius, and Of Gods and Men. But she's here today to talk to us about her new book, The Missing Thread, A History of the Ancient World Through the Women Who Shaped It. So, Daisy, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm struggling, apparently.
I think you need that rum and coke early, even though it's pretty early already.
It's after midday somewhere.
I was about to say it's 12 o'clock somewhere, so it's going to be 12 o'clock here before it will be 12 o'clock with you guys. So if you want to have a drink at the end of the podcast, Chris, feel free to.
I think I might need to after that intro.
We're here to talk about women, we're here to talk about ancient history, and of course, as everyone knows, this is my second love. And, well, talking about women in the classical period is incredibly... It's not easy, is the bottom line, is it? I mean, trying to find information...
It's incredibly difficult. Yeah, this is the challenge I set for myself. I thought I've got lots of full, wonderful histories on my bookshelves, which claim to be the sort of definitive history of the ancient world, but women don't really figure in them. You sort of hear of Boudica, you hear of Cleopatra, a handful of others, a few sort of emperors' wives, but they're not kind of an integral part of the story. And I'm convinced that they are. I mean, the whole history of the ancient world, women were there, they were living it, they were part of it. So I wanted to find them. So I basically had to go back to the very beginning and reread every single classical text I'd ever read in my life, with a view to looking for the women, because there are so many, they're there, but you overlook them, you miss them. And sort of as part of this, as a classicist, you're kind of used to handling lots of different types of materials. So I was looking at sort of inscriptions, art, archaeology, works of philosophy, history, literature, and it's just looking at them all in combination. And that's when you start to sort of bring together a fuller picture of the women.
I've got to. I can't believe you sat there and read every single text. The other issue with what you've done is they're all written by men.
This is the sorrowful tale. I mean, there are bits of writing by women, and throughout the book, I wanted to bring those to people's attention. So at the beginning of every chapter, I've translated a sort of fragment of women's poetry, or sort of short quotes that we have here and there, sometimes quoted by men. Sappho, we've got quite a few of her fragments, but overall, the vast majority of our sources are written by men, and they often have an agenda. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. We're lucky with some of them. They actually, Herodotus kind of stands out as someone who was quite interested in certain female figures because of what they achieved. So you have to read them just very, very carefully.
Regarding to text, what other, because you said you've used archaeology as well, and this is what's really fascinating, is that there are monuments, there are tombs, there are inscriptions that relate to women. How did you manage to use those as well?
Well, these often give you a really good view of ordinary women. And I don't mean ordinary women. I think all the women I write about are extraordinary in their own way. When you sort of read about what they had to live with and what they had to do on a daily basis, I mean, it's a lot more than I have to do on a daily basis in terms of sort of managing a house, weaving, doing absolutely everything. But the inscriptions on tombstones you mentioned, they often tell sort of their own story, and it's partly because you can look at the scale of some of these things. I mean, some of the grandest tombs in Rome, so if you look along the Appian Way, for example, are to women, and it's sort of things that husbands have left their wives who've died prematurely, maybe. And some of these tributes are quite sort of, I don't want to say boring, but they're quite formulaic. So, you get what a virtuous wife she was, how she loved her family, what a good mother she was. And you think, well, this is really nice, but you don't have a very good sense of their personality from that. And I think this is like the limitation sometimes with these things. So sometimes you need to look at inscriptions sort of in conjunction with other material that exists, with sort of works of poetry, for example. Sometimes you get a kind of eulogy within a poem to a woman, which kind of expands on the kind of thing you find on tombstones. So I think with tombstones in particular, you're looking at the scale and the artistry and some of the representations themselves. I put a picture in the plate section of my book, which I thought was quite interesting. It's two slave women, and that's quite unusual to see them two side by side. And one of them looks in particular quite masculine, and that's because she's actually been recarved. This originated as a representation of a man, and it's been repurposed. So that in itself is quite interesting. So I love looking at all the kind of the archaeological side alongside the text, just because you get a much sort of fuller, you get a 360 picture, and things that just don't really jump out at you off the page. Often they do when you're walking around a museum, or you're walking around, the Appian Way I mentioned, or sort of, somewhere on the ground in Rome, you get a different picture.
Before we start talking about some of these women and Chris starts asking his questions, I'm going to throw in another archaeology one, because going back to university when we were studying archaeology, you would obviously study papers and archaeological sites, and this whole debate of, is this a women's space? Is this a woman's object? For example, I know we're not going to talk about Pompeii today, but so for example, excavating a house and finding, I don't know, loom wheels or threads, for example, that are found in the kitchen area. Would we say that's just exclusively for women? Does that question kind of sort of make sense?
Yeah. So it is interesting. You find, particularly when you look at sort of domestic settings, you find a lot of sort of loom weights. And I say in the book that they're not exactly exciting to look at, these things, but they are important because they give you an idea that it's quite likely that in that space women were present, and you might expect them to be in a certain space. But when I look back to the Bronze Age, and I was looking at sort of Minoan Crete, so the sort of the palace at Knossos, you think of Arthur Evans, you think of the Minotaur, sort of this really early period. There was a particular room, and a lot of these sort of loom weights and beads and things which are associated with women, they were found in a space. We think, okay, so this is a room that might have been used for weaving. But then you also find in that space some sort of weaponry. So I think it was an arrowhead in the same space. And you think, well, how has that ended up there? Is this just a mistake? When things have been dug up, was it human error? Things have sort of fallen together when the ground has been excavated, or could we take this as evidence that men and women were actually sharing spaces a lot more than we think? And it is a really difficult question to answer, and I think it's on a case by case situation that you make a decision. In this particular case, I thought it was quite convincing, looking at sort of Minoan culture, this early Cretan culture, that women and men were actually sort of present together a lot more than they were in later Greek culture. I think when you look at pictures, you look at the frescoes, you've got men and women that they're sometimes segregated, but they are sort of enjoying the same sort of entertainments. They're in the same sort of palace setting. So, even something as rudimentary as a loom weight can actually be quite telling.
But we have this kind of idea of the ancient world of sort of women just sort of being wives, but that's not really true, because you've got warrior queens such as Tamiris, don't you?
Tamiris, yeah.
Tamiris,
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, she's amazing. Yeah. So you come across in the sources these women who sort of defy maybe your initial expectations of what women were actually doing in the ancient world. And she is someone who really does defy those expectations, not just of us actually, but of the people in her own time. So I'm talking about the period of the First Persian Empire here. We're talking about Cyrus the Great, very sort of strong king. He sort of was known for his amazing sort of expansionist efforts and the expansion of his kingdom. But he came up against Tamiris, who was the queen of a nomadic people, a nomadic tribe that she led. And he wanted to invade her land, and he actually proposed marriage to her, but she could see that he was just after her territory, so she turned him down. So he therefore decided to invade. And she issued the staunchest threats against him that if he went too far, that her people would retaliate. And Herodotus, who's the main source for this episode, describes the fighting as one of the the most keenly fought battles between his people and hers. And a lot of his men were completely annihilated. And Cyrus himself actually fell during this battle, and she fulfilled one of her earlier threats, which was to give him his fill of blood. And she did this quite literally. She actually got his decapitated head. It went into a bag filled with blood, a sort of bag made of sort of animal skin, and then she held onto this bag with his floating head in it and said, "There you go, I've fulfilled my earlier threat. Drink your fill." So she was absolutely formidable. And what's interesting actually is even if you look in sort of later Roman authors in particular, they look back at this episode, which I do believe is historical, by the way, not mythical. And they look at her with sort of a certain degree of awe. It wasn't all like, oh, what a terrible woman this was. They think, wow, I mean, here's a woman who's actually defeated one of the most powerful men in the world. So his downfall was absolutely catastrophic, for his people. And there she was.
This is the thing about ancient writers, is that when they talk about women, it's always something different, in the sense that if it was everyday things, oh, my wife made dinner, blah, 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 but suddenly you see a woman chopping off a man's head, or I don't know, you see women in the middle of the arena that are fighting with gladiator swords, whatever it could be. So I'm making stuff up now. But that's the only time you're going to hear about them, if they're doing something extraordinary or something really offensive.
This is true. And this is what makes our jobs as historians even harder. I mean, men seem to be drawn to writing about women who are rebellious in some respect. And I think this is the really challenging thing. Sometimes these women will do something that's absolutely extraordinary, and then so they'll write about that. And then there's quite a good sort of historical foundation for believing what they've written. But they then decide to kind of go completely overboard, and then, let their imaginations go wild and make up a load of other stuff, which is hooked onto that. So you have to kind of draw the line. And as a historian, you have to decide where to draw that line. On the flip side, what is really interesting is that women in the ancient world are sometimes written about purely because they are being praised for conforming to what was expected of them. So some of these women who are the complete antithesis of the Tamiris figure, they're not rebellious, they are conformist. They actually are known today. They've managed to be preserved in a historical record for being good girls, essentially. And some of those are, extraordinary in their own way. I mean, one of the figures who springs to mind was a woman called Cornelia in ancient Rome. And she is remembered as being the most loyal mother, because she raised the Gracchi brothers, and these were two boys who overthrew the political system in Rome and just changed the course of politics forever. And Cornelia was praised because there were these sort of like weird sort of anecdotes written about her. So other women would say, oh, look at my lovely jewelry, and they'd show off their fine things. And Cornelia would say, oh, well, my finest jewels are actually my children. And Roman men loved that. That's the kind of thing that made Roman men think, well, what a woman. And so that was written down about her. And she was praised as well because she actually helped in educating her sons. And it was quite rare. She'd actually learned as a girl, she'd learned Greek as well as Latin and been educated to quite a high standard. So when she was widowed in her 30s, she took over raising her children. And it was said that she originally had 12 children, but 3 of those children survived, the 2 boys, the Gracchi brothers, and a girl called Sempronia. And Cornelia helped oversee their education in Greek, as well as Latin. And then she hired the best tutors in the day to give her children the best possibilities, and then there's obviously bore fruit. You see these Gracchi brothers rise to the very forefront of Roman politics. They really push what was sort of constitutional. They championed the rights of the lower class people, the plebeians, and they really antagonized the Senate. And as a result of that, they both were actually assassinated. And there was a lot of interest then on Cornelia and a lot of praise for her stoicism and the way that she handled her grief and the way she carried on living. And she actually then retreated. We were talking about Pompeii earlier. She went down to the Bay of Naples, lived in the most extraordinary, luxurious villa, and had her own sort of almost like a literary salon down there. And she was commemorated with, again, public monuments. So we don't actually have any of the statues that were put up of her, but we do have the base of one of them. And she was respected as the mother of the Gracchi. And she hadn't done anything extraordinary like chopping off a man's head, but she had raised these people, these 2 men who had done so much and made such a mark on the political landscape. And she'd sort of shown herself to be incredibly brave. What's special about her as well is that we actually have some of her writing, and some about how rare it is. We actually have part of a letter she wrote to her younger son, trying to deter him from following in his brother's footsteps and antagonizing the Senate, and really trying to put him off because she's worried about it. So she is extraordinary for really actually sort of conforming to many of the things that were expected of her, being sort of a good mother. So that just goes to show you don't have to be this rebellious woman to make your mark on the historical record.
I think I might rephrase the next question because I can, and just to put you on the spot a little bit. So I'm going to give you a theory, and let's see if you agree or disagree. Thucydides was a woman.
I have never heard this theory. Is this theory that is...
Oh no, I haven't made this one up. I didn't. So we were chatting to another historian, God, I think probably about 2 years ago, and she did a lot of work on Thucydides. And some of the rumours are that Thucydides was actually a woman, or at least his later works were of maybe his daughter, or not exactly him, because there were different anomalies in the writing and things like that. So I just thought I'd throw that at you now.
That is extraordinary, and I'm sorry I haven't heard this one before. I'd find that incredibly unlikely, and I say that in particular by contrasting Thucydides with Herodotus, because if you look in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, there are very, very few women in those books. Herodotus' histories, on the other hand, are filled with women. And they're not always positive portraits, but he's the one who wrote about Tomyris, with a sense of wonder. He wrote about Artemisia, the sole female naval commander on either side of the Greco-Persian Wars. In Thucydides, you really don't get very, very much of a sense of what women were doing during the Peloponnesian War. So I'd find it sort of slightly unexpected to think of Thucydides being a woman, and also because Thucydides actually played an active military role in the Peloponnesian War and was shamed as a result of that. And I think to be able to sort of to write in this kind of war reportage, we often talk about his work as being this sort of early reportage from the front line, would have been very, very difficult, because I think women were not really there at that point. We get a lot sort of better sense from other sources of what they were doing at home while this was going on. So it's an interesting theory, but I'm not sure I buy into it.
I just thought it's an interesting theory, and it's kind of funny. And I just thought your take. I mean, because the next question is something along the same lines, and I kind of thought just mess it around a little bit and make it a little bit more interesting. But can we expand? Because I know Chris is going to ask the next one, but can we expand a little bit about the women's experiences at that time? Do we know anything from the writings
in the time of Thucydides?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So. There's a real change. I think what's really interesting when you look at Greek history in particular is the experience of women changes really drastically by the century. So if you look back to 7th century BC, when Sappho was around, and on the island of Lesbos, women seem to have a little bit more freedom than they do in 5th century BC Athens, which was a really dark period to be a woman. You're very, very limited. Unless you are a hetaira, a sort of a higher class courtesan, who had limitations themselves, that at least they were able to converse with men, to go to symposia, to sort of not be stuck at home or sort of behind a veil. They had a bit more freedom. When you go forward in time, things again start to look a little bit better. And I say this partly on the basis of what men have written about the period of the Peloponnesian Wars. There's a really good example if you're looking at the Lysistrata. And this is a comedy which was written by Aristophanes, and it was put on during the Peloponnesian War. And in this comedy, the women arrange a sex strike to try and convince their husbands that it would be a good idea to agree peace terms. So they refuse to sleep with their husbands until the Spartans and Athenians have come to some agreement to stop this. I mean, the Peloponnesian War that Thucydides was writing about went on and on and on for decades. And there was a real anxiety. So even though this play was written by a man, it does actually seem to reflect the true experience of women during the Peloponnesian War. They want peace. They're absolutely fed up. They actually sort of take over the Athenian Acropolis at one point. And what's clever is, even though Lysistrata is a comical character, she's a fictional character, she is widely believed to have been based on a real woman who was based on the Acropolis called Lysimachie, and she was a priestess. And in a sense, she did have control over part of the Acropolis. So in the play, when all these women absolutely take over the space, it's kind of just an extension of the reality of what was, actually happening, that women had some kind of religious role within that space. And during the Peloponnesian War, because so many of the men were away fighting, there's a strong argument that women were actually going to the theatre and watching these plays in broader numbers than they had before. Conventionally, this was something that men did only. But there was no one really left to see these plays. So it seems very likely that the theatre was opened up and women were seeing these plays. So that's why you start to see in plays like this a much sort of stronger reflection of women's experience. That a lot of these plays seem to be geared much more towards communicating the kind of distaff side of the war experience. So I think, from a female point of view, it was an incredibly frustrating period, and you really get a sense of that through reading fiction. And as a historian, this is sometimes, I think, to later historians, it sounds really strange, but for classicists, it's really important to look at the literary side alongside the historical sources, because it's often there in these plays, which are very, very political, that you get a much stronger reflection of what was going on.
So, beyond only having one album that anyone really remembers, what was Dido's curse?
Good old day. I have that album still somewhere.
Me too.
Definitely back in the day. Dido, among her other skills, I'm talking about different Dido. Dido was the queen of Carthage, and she is a mythical queen, and she is a heroine of sorts, a tragic heroine in Virgil's Aeneid, the great sort of Latin epic. And she is the kind of love interest for Aeneas, who escapes from the Trojan War. And he stops off and has a relationship with her. But then it's his destiny to found a new home for the Trojan refugees on Italian soil. And he realizes that he can't stop and live with her in Carthage forever and ever, as she wants him to. So he just abandons her, sails away, on his mission. And she throws herself onto her own pyre. And she's so upset by her abandonment by Aeneas that she actually issues a curse. She says that there should not be any good relations between her people and Aeneas's people looking forward. And this is in this poem, it's in this epic poem. But even though this is fiction, again, we've got this kind of crossover. when people look back historically, they saw this as almost a kind of origin tale, the kind of explanation for why Rome and Carthage historically were then at war for hundreds of years. These were the two sort of superpowers, and they engaged in what was known as the Punic Wars between each other. There were 3 Punic Wars, and people look back to the story of Dido's curse and Aeneas's, I would say, maltreatment of her, but they probably didn't see it like that at all. But her abandonment and the blame that she put on Aeneas for her situation, and they look back at that as the sort of the beginning of these Punic Wars. So it's a really interesting episode in which I think women are a lot of the time being blamed for the outbreak of war. We find that historically with Aspasia, for example. She was the sort of common law wife of Pericles in early democratic Athens. She was blamed for wars as well. So this happens a lot. But for Dido, I think it takes on extra interest just because these Punic Wars were so hotly fought between the two sides and so defining of both sides.
So we also have double standards elsewhere because we have the actions of I get this pronunciation wrong, but Musia and the poet Catullus. These double standards still exist, but how common was it still in the ancient periods?
There are a lot of double standards. We're talking now about late Republican Rome. So the poet Catullus is sort of, I actually wrote my first book on the poet Catullus. He was the most erotic poet in Rome. And he is famed for writing about his very rocky relationship with his lover, Lesbia, who most people believe was based on a real woman called Clodia, who was in a relationship with a senior senator. And so this woman, Clodia, actually found herself in court being accused by Cicero, of all people, of being a sort of a prostitute, essentially, and a cheap prostitute at that, even though there was no basis for this whatsoever. And Catullus, in his poems, when he's broken up with Lesbia, he presents her in a similar way. He describes her as servicing men on crossroads, just to put it in a slightly coy way. And he had the same to say about other women. So we find a reference to a woman he calls Mucia. And we think this was the sort of alternative name for Mycilia, who was married to Pompey the Great. And Pompey divorced his wife on accusation of adultery. It seems to me very unlikely that she was committing adultery, just because I think Pompey wanted to marry up. He wanted a more politically advantageous marriage, and you find a lot of men in this period divorcing their wives, accusing them of committing adultery, and then marrying someone who has a more powerful father to help them up the political ladder. But that said, you find in Catullus, he really plays with this idea as well. He said that initially this woman had 2 lovers, one of whom was Julius Caesar, and over time there were about 1,000 more competing against each of these men. So it was very difficult to be a woman in the public eye. It was very difficult to be married to a politician because poets and other writers really saw you as fair game. And I think it's probably just the same today.
Let's stick to this theme: politics, writers, affairs, and God knows what else is going on, because I'll come back to Cicero, because that's a really good question. I will come back to Cicero, but let's talk about Fulvia, because she's a very prominent person in Rome. She marries Mark Antony, and she does a lot behind the scenes, doesn't she? Tell us a little bit about what she does and where she ends up.
Fulvia is an amazing woman. She is, I'd say, I mean, it seems to me so weird that we haven't really heard of her, but we have heard of Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the woman that Mark Antony was having an affair with in the East. He was meanwhile married to Fulvia, who was in Rome, basically doing a lot of his work for him while he was there. So she had been married twice already when she married Mark Antony. Her first husband was this ruthless demagogue who was notorious again on the political scene, and he was called Publius Clodius Pulcher, and he was the brother of the woman who Catullus was having an affair with. So it's all quite interlocked. He died, and he was killed in a sort of scuffle at a crossroads in a conflict involving gladiators. And he was killed by his enemy, his political enemy, Milo. And Fulvia really stirred up the crowd against Milo and his people by exposing Clodius's body so they could see all the wounds that had been carried out, all these wounds in his flesh. And this really stirred up anger. So she had kind of form by the time she married Mark Antony. What she then did was, Mark Antony was in an alliance for power. And within this alliance, there was the man who'd be the future Emperor Augustus. It was known as Octavian at that stage. And she tried to champion her husband relative to Octavian. The relationship between these three men was already crumbling, but she thought she really wanted Mark Antony to get the upper hand. It was probably in her mind already that the possibility would be there for him to be sole ruler if Octavian was to be battered down. So together with her brother-in-law, Mark Antony's brother, she helped to arrange essentially a war. It's known as the Perusine War. It happened in the city known as Perugia in Italy in 41 to 40 BC. And this became the site of a siege. And her forces, who she actually helped to pull together, it's actually said in the sources that she held onto a sword. She helped to add recruits to this when her side began to be sort of worsted in battle. So she's playing a very, very key role. The city is besieged. It goes against her. So she's having to sort of hunker down for her own life. And what's really interesting is you can read the historical sources on this and you think, yeah, sure, really did this woman get together forces? Was she actually involved in this war? Was it her war? But actually the archaeological record is fascinating on this, because what we have surviving at the site of the siege, incredibly unusual for ancient battles, I have to say, are these pellet-like bullets. And these bullets were sort of slingshot bullets that were flung over the walls of the siege. And they have really crude graffiti written on them. And some of this graffiti is directed towards Octavian, and some of it is directed towards Fulvia. And one of them memorably says, "I'm aiming for Fulvia's clitoris." This word, I say it in the sort of polite way, it's more, we might say clit or something. It's quite a slangy way of writing it in the Latin. And you just think, oh my God. And you look at the other ones on the side. I mean, some of them say, "I'm aiming for Octavian's arsehole." I mean, these things are really brutal. You think of sort of bombs in the Second World War with messages written on them. This is a really ancient form of that. And there you go. You've got a woman who's actually being targeted as a result of this. She lost this war, and Mark Antony was not remotely thankful to her for the effort she'd paid, to try and champion him while he was away. And she actually sort of went over to meet him in Greece, and it said that every time he tried to leave Cleopatra would sort of look gaunt and be tearful, and he was worried that she'd commit suicide if he went to go and meet up with his wife. So there's a real sort of idea in the sources of these two women pulling either side of Antony, him being sort of stuck in the middle, but really it's his own fault.
Mark Antony is a bit of a dick. But there's another man that really doesn't like Fulvia, and I want to talk about Cicero.
Cicero, yes.
So you talk about Cicero in your book, and everybody who does listen to this regularly knows that I think Cicero is a dick, even though I do feel slightly sorry for him after reading the Robert Harris books. It kind of makes him a little bit more human, but still a giant dick.
Well, Cicero certainly had it in for Mark Antony. He had it in for Fulvia as well. We read these very abusive speeches that he wrote against them. It's really a tirade known as the Philippics. And he talks about Fulvia really kind of glorying in being spattered by blood of these men that Mark Antony was killing. Is quite OTT. And when Mark Antony arranged for Cicero to be killed, the head of Cicero, as we know, was removed. Same with his hand, the hand with which he'd written these offending speeches. They were brought back to Rome, and it said that Fulvia actually spat on Cicero's decapitated head and stuck her hairpins into his tongue. Do we believe this? I don't. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But then, we had the story of Thamyris earlier and the floating head of Cyrus. So difficult to interpret. But I'd say Cicero, amazing orator, but not a man to be married to or to have anything to do with if you're a woman.
I think she probably would have spat at him, but the pins is going a little bit too far.
It's quite extreme, isn't it? But I turned against Cicero slightly in the book, and I was trying to put sort of my modern prejudices or whatever aside, but you just can't help but feel really, really sorry for his wife. I mean, they've been married for years and years and years. He's sent off into exile. She does everything to try and get him recalled. He does come back. And when he does, he divorces her. So they've been married for ages. And then he instead, so he's about 60 at that point, he marries a 14 or 15-year-old girl. Not that unusual in Rome. Again, we have to put our modern prejudices aside. And his poor wife, ex-wife Terentia, said, oh, well, he was obviously really charmed by her beauty. But then Cicero's right-hand man, Tiro, great sort of figure in the Robert Harris novels, Tiro said, oh, well, Cicero really needed her money. And that's probably true. Like in exile, they'd had to sort of sell off a lot of their stuff, and he wanted his life back again. And he was actually guardian of this girl whose name was Publilia. So he knew exactly how much money she had and how much money he could get his hands on. So it all looks quite opportunistic. That marriage didn't last, needless to say.
Good for her.
I feel a bit worried when you said not a person to be married to. I thought, yeah, that's the tag on my dating profile.
Just change your name to Cicero, it'll probably say it quicker.
But moving on. So everyone's heard of Nero, but there's one of the women who often gets overlooked in his story is his mother, Agrippina.
Agrippina is extraordinary. So she, from the very beginning, I mean, Nero became emperor when he was about 16, 17 years old. So really young. And all the coins that were minted, the works of art that were put up in the provinces show that she was essentially his co-ruler to begin with, because he was still kind of learning the ropes. And this seems to have really carried on being the case for much longer than Nero was happy about. So there are some really extraordinary passages describing Nero's efforts to get rid of his mother and to stop her from interfering in his work as emperor as he saw it. So he ejected her from the palace to begin with, and she took up residence in a riverside villa. And then, even then, apparently she carried on being involved in his work. So Nero hired men to clamber into boats and then shout through her windows of this new villa that she was in and threaten her with lawsuits. I mean, really amazing. He also hated the fact that she had a lot of complaints about the women he was seeing. So to begin with, there was a woman, he was married off. She had him married to his stepsister, and he wasn't really very happy about that. But this woman happened to be quite popular. She was the daughter of Emperor Claudius. But Nero clearly wasn't very keen on her. So he was seeing all these other women, and Agrippina really just did not approve. Particularly one of them was a former slave, and she seems to have seen this woman as being a bit kind of beneath him and discouraged the relationship. But then Nero fell in love with a new woman who actually came from Pompeii. Her name was Pompeia. And at this point, I think there's a lot in the sources suggesting that Pompeia really sort of encouraged Nero to try and cut his ties with his mother as much as possible. And we get onto this stage of Nero arranging for the death of his own mother, and there being sort of various attempts on this. And eventually she is down in this luxurious beach resort of Baiae in the Bay of Naples. And as she's sailing back, some lead is weighted onto the canopy of the boat so that the ceiling falls in order to collapse, to sort of crush her. But she survives because, and this is what to me, this makes it seem so credible. The description is that she manages to survive because even though the ceiling falls in, she's sitting on a couch and the arms of the couch are just high enough that they stop the ceiling from crushing her. They stop, so she's actually able to sort of crouch down and survive. And that seems like such a key detail. It seems so realistic. Anyway, she is injured. She has a serious shoulder injury, but nonetheless, she's able to swim to safety on the shore. And it's there that she's finished off. She's knifed to death. And supposedly in her final moments, she orders the men to stab her in the womb, which is the source of all the evil. And I think this is, again, one of those theatrical moments, those flourishes in the text that we don't take quite seriously. But she was clearly extraordinary. And I do think that Nero was responsible for causing her death. I mean, Nero, very, very weird character, full stop, but incredibly theatrical man. He actually then played the part of a man who killed his mother on the stage being where Nero felt most at home. So it seems very Freudian and very, very weird, but Agrippina was clearly very, very strong and robust.
First of all, what a way to treat your mother. It's just, and second of all, I think that's one of the things Nero is most well known for, is killing his mother. So if anybody ever mentions him, even, outside in the public, you go, oh, Nero, oh yeah, he's the guy that killed his mother.
Yeah. This is what stayed with us, isn't it? I mean, there are so many negative things about Nero. I try to be fair on Nero as much as this is possible in the book, because what we do know is that the people who are writing the sources, the historians of Tacitus, Suetonius, our main kind of sources, they are sort of members of the economic elite. So they're kind of equestrian class, the senatorial class is just above them. And these are the people that Nero really antagonized through his rule. The sort of the everyday, the lower class people, the sort of the normal people of Rome, generally quite liked him. And what's interesting is that after Nero died, his tomb was never free of flowers. So he did have supporters, these people who he bought the affection of with his bread and circuses and his entertainments, and memorized people's names. At the very beginning of his rule, he was seen to be quite good. And it seems that he did have the affection of the people of Rome more broadly, but he didn't have the affection of the people who mattered. And the senatorial elite, they were the people who pulled all the strings. So by the end of the day, he was completely isolated, and he had very little choice but to kill himself.
When it comes to Nero, I don't know. I always, probably because I watched too many movies, I always go back to the producers with the Nero stamped on his wife. It was Popeye, wasn't he? He stamped her to death. It's the only thing I remember of him.
Yeah, no, again, another of these horrible things. Again, I think this is not true. It's said that he stamped or kicked his pregnant wife to death after she told him off for coming home late because he'd been at the races that day. I think much more likely she suffered a miscarriage and died from consequences of that. But a lot of these horrible stories stuck to him because of the terrible reputation that he acquired.
Yeah, and mud sticks.
Yeah.
So we've covered kind of a clutch of stories covered in your book. Is there anyone that's one of your favourites, or someone that you've got a really burning desire to tell us all about that we may have missed?
There are so many. I have to say there are several hundred women I've covered in this book, so there's a lot to choose from. But someone who I think is amazing and sort of linked to Nero is Locusta, and she was the chief toxicologist of Rome. She was a woman. She came from Gaul. She had a familiarity with poisons and toxins that no one else was believed to have. She taught people how to handle these. She was in high demand, and in Nero's court. I mean, she's said to have been responsible for supplying the fatal dose that Nero used to poison his very popular stepbrother, Britannicus. She was called upon time and time again, and she had a way of knowing how to mix a substance that would make it look not suspicious, make that that someone would have a kind of slow reaction to it. Nero said to her, well, when this happened, well, why should I need to fear the law? Just give me a really fast acting one. He just didn't care if you looked suspicious. So, you know, she should use these things, she'd mix them up, and they'd be tried on various animals before they were given to humans. So she was a very interesting figure. She was then actually killed after Nero died by his successor, who kind of saw her as this kind of ugly legacy of the rule of his predecessor. But while she was there, it seems quite amazing that she was there sort of actively working and playing with all these different toxins, which were sort of naturally derived in Roman times. You're sort of thinking of like belladonna, things like that, you know, you could get from plants. So Locusta, remember her name.
Daisy, this has been great. Absolutely love it. Can you just remind our listeners the name of your book?
Yes, it is The Missing Thread, a new history of the ancient world through the women who shaped it.
Fabulous. We will get that into our bookshop, which basically means you get a bit, we get a bit, and the Amazon rainforest, oh God, I just said the word, never mind. That place will not be getting all the money and building a rocket ship. Isn't that what you usually say, Chris?
Yeah, rocket ship, Death Star, the kind of things that the lawyers are probably going to want to speak to me about at some point. I don't have any money, so it's fine.
It's been great having you on, Daisy.
It's been really good fun. Thank you so much.
And if you liked this episode, yeah, I know, I have to do all this rubbish at the end of this. I do apologise. If you do like this episode, leave us a 5-star shiny review on Apple. You can head to our new website, which is www.historyhack.co.uk. You can buy us a drink or a one-off donation at ko-fi.com/historyhack. Again, we need to fund all those various habits. Funnily enough, Nero, who's been sleeping in the background and snoring away, he needs to be fed. He's a big dog and he needs a lot of food. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/historyhack. You can go on a date with Chris. Who wouldn't want to do that? And I'm going to leave you all with my lovely joke right at the end of this. And as always, why did the lobster blush? Because it saw the ocean's bottom. Thanks so much, guys.